Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're diving into a pretty heavy but absolutely crucial topic. We are taking a really focused, deeply curious look at the history of systemic violence. We're going to impartially trace the historical consensus on exactly how the organized destruction of communities actually evolved. It's like a giant puzzle, and together we are going to unpack some of the most pivotal historical shifts that literally laid the groundwork for the modern world. So, let's kick things off with a fascinating question. Did genocidal systems exist before modern biological race theories? Now, to truly understand modern colonial extermination, we can't just start in the 20th century, or even the 16th for that matter. We actually have to turn the clock way back to examine the medieval concept of the internal other. We really need to see how the blueprint for systemic eradication was drafted long before anyone even invented modern racial categories. Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the roots of eradication, move into the Albigensian Crusade, explore erasure and scapegoating, look at Mongol exterminatory warfare, then the Taino catastrophe, and finally, wrap it all up with the evolution of genocide. Let's jump right in.
Part 1. The Roots of Eradication, Tracing the Origins of Systemic Violence.
Now, what's really interesting here is the core distinction between the two eras. We are strictly looking at the historical consensus regarding what actually motivated medieval versus modern campaigns of destruction. When we think of modern genocides, they're almost always built on biological race theory. You know, the idea that a group's identity is biologically hardwired. But medieval campaigns, they were driven by entirely different engines. We're talking religion, heresy, conquest, forced conversion, and expulsion. The medieval mindset was entirely focused on eliminating a belief system and destroying an identity. They'd often offered forced conversion as an alternative to death.
And when you lay it all out, history reveals this crystal-clear, centuries-long pattern of systemic eradication. Just look at the sheer density of these events. We go from the Rhineland massacres in 1096, right at the start of the First Crusade, over to the massacre at Béziers in 1209, then to the Mongol destruction of Kiev in 1240, and finally landing on that incredibly pivotal year of 1492. These aren't just random, isolated dates. They form a clear evolutionary timeline that paves the way for our deeper dive today.
Moving on to Part 2, the Albigensian Crusade, targeting the internal other in southern France.
This specific campaign, which ran from 1209 to 1229, is widely considered one of the strongest medieval European examples of targeting an internal other. But to really grasp the violence, we need to know exactly who was in the crosshairs. The Cathars were a Christian religious group living down in southern France. The Catholic Church, however, viewed their specific beliefs as total heresy. Because of this, Pope Innocent III did something completely unprecedented. He launched a full-blown crusade. Not to the Holy Land, but right into the heart of southern France to eliminate these internal others.
And that brings us to a literally chilling phrase from a papal legate at the massacre at Béziers in 1209, where northern French crusaders captured the city. The quote goes, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Now, historians do debate the exact wording, but they pretty much all agree that it perfectly captures the terrifying mentality of the campaign. It was about indiscriminate killing. Distinguishing between a Catholic and a Cathar didn't matter nearly as much as just achieving total annihilation.
The methods they used were absolutely devastating. Crusaders massacred entire towns, burned suspected Cathars alive, and completely dismantled their religious centers. And it didn't stop there. Afterward, they deployed the Inquisition to hunt down any remaining survivors. So the crucial point here, the why this matters, is that the goal wasn't just to defeat a rival army on a battlefield. The goal was to permanently eradicate a culture and its belief system. And they succeeded. Catharism was essentially wiped off the map. Historically speaking, this campaign behaves incredibly like what we would label today as religious genocide. Section 3. Erasure and scapegoating, the Baltic peoples and Jewish communities.
Let's expand our view across medieval Europe for a second to see how cultural erasure played out in the north. Up in the Baltic region, you have the Northern Crusades spanning from the 12th to the 14th centuries. Here, German crusading orders, especially the Teutonic Knights, conquered pagan peoples like the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians. They forcibly converted to populations, violently suppressed those who resisted, and outright seized their land. The Old Prussians are actually a prime example of this. Their native language completely vanished. German colonization effectively overwrote the native society. Many historians point out that this behaves exactly like early settler colonialism and cultural genocide.
Meanwhile, around the same era, during the First Crusade in 1096, we see crusading mobs attacking Jewish communities in cities like Mainz, Worms, Cologne, and Speyer. Mobs murdered entire families, destroyed synagogues, and forced mass conversions. Thousands of people died. It's one of medieval Europe's clearest, most brutal examples of religiously motivated extermination and scapegoating. And why does this specific event matter so much for our broader historical understanding? Because it helped establish deep-seated anti-Semitic traditions that directly fed into later expulsions, pogroms, and eventually modern anti-Semitism.
On to Section 4, Mongol Exterminatory Warfare, Secular Strategic Annihilation.
So, we've been intensely focused on European religious violence, but what happens when the threat is an external, entirely secular force? Well, in the 13th century, the Mongols swept into Eastern Europe. They devastated Rus territories, Hungary and Poland. Cities that dared to resist them, like Kiev in 1240, were completely annihilated. We're talking enormous, staggering civilian death tolls here. But here is the absolutely key distinction we have to make. This was not racial genocide. The Mongols used systematic exterminatory warfare and terror as a cold, calculated military strategy. The message was brutally simple. Resist us, and your city ceases to exist.
Which brings us to Section 5, the Taino Catastrophe, the 1492 collision.
This is where we reach the climax of our evolutionary arc. This is where ancient patterns of conquest violently collide with the dawn of the early modern world. But before the colonizers ever set foot across the Atlantic, we really have to examine the mindset they brought with them. By 1492, Spain had completely expelled its Jewish populations, unless they converted, and Muslim populations faced very similar persecution following the Reconquista. This represents a massive, game-changing shift towards proto-ethnic nationalism. It laid the groundwork for European ideas about having a pure religious or ethnic identity, and that exact mindset was the lens through which they viewed the New World. So, when the Spanish arrived in the Caribbean, places like Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, they encountered the Taino people, and they quickly implemented a system called the encomienda. It's vital to define this clearly. This was a deadly forced labor economy. And when you combine that forced labor with mass killings and newly introduced diseases, it led to starvation, brutal punishments, tragic rates of suicide, and the total social collapse of the indigenous populations. Let's look at how this builds into our modern understanding. Current estimates suggest millions of Taino people may have died across the Caribbean after European contact. Now, it's true, historians do debate the specific terminology here, mostly because disease caused a massive portion of that population collapse. However, many argue that the label of genocide absolutely applies. Why? Because the colonizers knowingly imposed these deadly systems. The mass violence wasn't accidental. It was intentional, and it was documented extensively by horrified first-hand witnesses like the Spanish priest Bartolomé de las Casas.
Finally, Section 6, the evolution of genocide, synthesizing medieval and colonial patterns.
And this brilliantly illustrates our whole journey today. When we synthesize everything we've covered, a really clear evolution emerges. The Cathars faced religious genocide. The Baltic peoples were subjected to early settler colonialism. Jewish communities faced the brutal forces of proto-ethnic nationalism, and the Taino suffered colonial genocide. Now, these are all distinct events, sure, but they are intimately connected in the grand evolution of systemic violence. You can draw a direct line showing how ancient religious conquests transitioned right into modern systems of eradication.
So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder. How does the groundwork laid in 1492 continue to influence modern concepts of ethnic and religious identity? The history of eradication isn't just trapped in the past. Its shadow actively extends into how our modern world understands race, religion, and identity today. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you in the next one.